Welcome to the South Carolina High School Credential Video Learning Series. This webinar is on making sound program decisions. From the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition, Catherine Fowler, and from the School District of Oconee County, Marge Bright. Also on the line from the Office of Special Education Services, and more. Everyone, I introduce you to Marge Bright.
Hey, good morning, everybody. I'd like to start by saying just how thankful I am to TASC and OSES for their hard work in rolling out the credential. Before the credential, our students had one of two options when graduating high school. They could earn the South Carolina High School Diploma or a district certificate of attendance. But those students earning a certificate of attendance, their skill sets varied substantially, as there were some students with disabilities with severe cognitive and adaptive needs, as well as those who were able to earn some Carnegie units, but just not enough to graduate with a state diploma. Likewise, the employability skills of these students were vastly different, but they were graduating with the same district certificate of attendance. Well, I'm so thankful that now we have the credential pathway to provide job readiness opportunities for students, to ensure there's evidence of their employability skills, and to honor the work that they've already completed while being enrolled in our schools. So a big thank you to everyone who has had a part. Now to get things rolling with this presentation, we have to begin by recognizing that sound decisions for any student begin by considering data. It's important to not only know what students want to do after exiting high school, but to also know their strengths, needs, preferences, interests, and work experience. When IEP teams are determining whether or not the South Carolina High School credential is an appropriate pathway, they need to carefully consider the requirements of the credential and whether there is existing data that supports it would be an appropriate pathway for students to work towards. For example, with regard to the academic coursework requirements, IEP team members need to be familiar with the standards for the essentials of English, math, science, and social studies courses, and to know the students' present levels of performance and trajectory of progress in these areas, and ask, does the student have the necessary foundational skills to be able to make appropriate progress towards meeting those standards? And if so, what evidence supports it? Will the student be able to complete a career portfolio that includes a multimedia project? Can they earn results on a work readiness assessment that demonstrate that the student is ready for competitive employment? And again, if so, what evidence supports that? If the evidence is not there, then perhaps the credential isn't the appropriate pathway. In our district, if a student and an IEP team are on the fence about pursuing the credential versus a certificate, we always give the student the benefit of the doubt and we pursue the credential. We have to remember that IDEA and the requirement for least restrictive environment, cannot be forgotten. Later in the presentation, we're going to talk about a tool that IEP teams can use to gather and examine this data. But first, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Catherine Fowler, who's going to talk about predictors of success, which happen to align beautifully with the requirements for the credential. Catherine?
Thank you, Marge. And thank you to TASC and to South Carolina for me getting to be a part of this today. I am with the National Technical Assistance Center on Transition. We're national, as indicated, but we are just right up the road in Charlotte. So I'm glad to be with you. We at the National TA Center have, through looking at research, have identified this list that you see in front of you of 23 factors associated with, through the research, predictive of success for students with disabilities as they leave school. So these are associated with better employment outcomes than we typically see for students with disabilities, better engagement in post-secondary education or training, and or better measures of quality of life, satisfaction with life, or integration in the community than we typically see for students with disabilities. So these have been examined closely through looking at rigorous research. And I don't know that there's anything particularly on this list that will surprise you, but we reference these and encourage districts, as Marge was talking about looking at data, to examine whatever the program or whether it's a credential or a pathway, whatever activities students are engaged in, that this be a starting point to look at the quality of the program that students are participating in, because we know that these things are associated with better outcomes. We want to be sure that our programs reflect these. So I'm just going to talk through, because there are 23 of them, that can be, you know, a little daunting to look at the list. So we've tried to group them into relevant, and related categories. So you'll see in this first group, the first bullet are items associated with career development, with work experiences, with other activities associated with students understanding what their interests may be, and then really pursuing those and developing skills in particular areas. So things like career awareness are activities that can begin at very young ages on through high school. Career and technical education, so students who participate in and pursue career and technical education coursework and a sequence of coursework, those students tend to be more successful after high school. Paid employment, or really any employment experiences, but certainly paid employment is associated with better outcomes. So I'm going to pause for a second. I know Marge has some examples I think you all can think about in your own districts or your schools or your settings, some examples of these, but I know Marge was going to share a couple of things that she's familiar with in South Carolina.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine. Yeah, in Oconee County, the first three, career awareness, career and technical education and occupational courses, that kind of information is provided through our employability education courses that are part of the credential pathway. We do also have opportunities for paid employment experiences for our kiddos. So we have a school-based enterprise, actually a couple of school-based enterprises at our career center. One of those being the Learning to Grow Gardens, where there is a greenhouse, and our teacher there is working with a local farmer to teach our students not only how to grow produce, but how to process it. They even sell some of the things that they grow to the Clemson Area Food Exchange. And the food that they grow is also used in our Considerate Cafe, which was a program that started back when our teacher received a grant from the State Department. And so at our Considerate Cafe, students have an opportunity to learn how to make the food to serve the community. And those are paid experiences. And, you know, the students earn minimum wage to be able to, or when they do work in those settings. We also have students that work at some local businesses while they are still enrolled. So part of their day may be working part-time at Ingalls or in a neighboring manufacturing environment. Our district also has some apprenticeships that we started last school year. So there are some job opportunities that are available in maintenance, grounds, food service. We cooperate with Sodexo. So those are just a few examples of some of the things we have going on in our district.
Those are great examples. And they're, I'm sure as you all reflect on your own what's happening in your own schools or your own settings, you can think of other examples as well. Certainly career development is a continuum of activities. So you can see here in this list of predictors, there are, you know, simply being aware of careers and understanding what your interests may be, and then actually having some of those experiences and studies to prepare students for greater success. And whether those be work experiences in the school, and then of course in the community being ideal, and competitive employment being, you know, where we're headed. But all of those things, Marge mentioned apprenticeships, Project Search. I know there's some sites that is certainly an example of this predictor. Moving into the next category, we have lumped these different predictors together really as more structural. So these may or may not be things that at a teacher level we necessarily have a lot of control over, but knowing that these are available and certainly related to, you know, the credential option, thinking about diploma status and program of study, what options are we making available to students, what do we share with them and their parents, how do we prepare students to participate in different and the most relevant programs of study. Community experiences in the research really reflects everything from community work experiences as well as community-based instruction that you might engage in to teach specific life skills. So some of those are more programmatic kinds of decisions. The degree to which students are integrated with other students without disabilities in their education is also a predictor of success after school. As I mentioned, I don't know that any of these are shocking, but I think that it's helpful to have the list in front of you. And so this group is really more of these structure types of predictors.
Okay, and in Oconee County, considering the inclusion in general education, you know, for our essentials of science and social studies courses, our students working toward the credential are actually participating in those courses alongside of general education students. So we've got a gen ed teacher that may be, you know, teaching a science course to gen ed, but that teacher is addressing the standards for the essentials of science for kids working with the credentials who are in the same classroom. So those courses are set up in PowerSchool so that it's actually like two courses that are happening at the same time. And the general education teacher and special education teacher collaborate outside the classroom to make sure that the needs of both groups of students are met.
That's a nice example of that. And it leads nicely into the third category of a group of predictors, are what we look at as those collaborative predictors. So I think any of us involved in transition recognize the critical nature of interagency collaboration and how important it is to have, it's not something that the school can do by themselves. It's not something that, you know, a teacher can do alone. So how connected are students to vocational rehabilitation services? Are students engaged now in pre-employment transition services? Are there other agencies that are involved if it's a student with higher support needs? And then of course, relationships with families. And we also are certainly aware of how important family involvement and family expectations are for student success. So how are we laying the groundwork for families to have high expectations that their child can be employed after high school, that their child can participate in learning beyond high school, and how are we laying that foundation while students are, you know, even much younger than transition age. And then student support reflects sort of a variety of efforts, but things around mentoring efforts, counseling. So this is where maybe our related services personnel come in a good bit. So what are the additional supports that we have in place that are preparing students for success after school? So all of these, again, this sort of bucket of predictors are related to the collaborative efforts that are necessary in transition. Did you have anything to add there, Marge?
Yes, thank you. For in Oconee County, we do have an interagency collaboration that we call OIDA, our Oconee Interagency Transition Alliance. And so we work very closely with vocational rehabilitation, Department of Disabilities and Special Needs, Family Connections. We have business representatives that serve with our group, and also parents of students with disabilities, because we really need their input as well. And then our transition specialist, who is phenomenal, also participates in the Foothills CAN Collaborative Action Network. So, you know, we really are trying hard to work and partner with other agencies, because just like you said, a district can't do it on their own. And, you know, the outcomes for students are so much better when we can wrap around and work together. and tap into each other's resources on behalf of kids.
Absolutely. And then this final bullet, these are student skills. So the first 3 bullets have to do with maybe factors or programs or processes that we have in place in our schools or within our districts. The final bullet are skills that we know from research, if students exit high school with higher levels of these skills, they tend to achieve better post-school outcomes. So when you look at this, you'll see quite a few are in the family of self-determination skills, things around self-determination, goal setting, psychological empowerment is a newly identified predictor, the youth autonomy and decision-making. So certainly all of the work that you do in the area of promoting self-determination skills, but then you'll also see self-care skills, social skills, technology skills, it's transportation really and travel skills, so students' abilities to navigate their communities. And then I certainly don't want to underestimate academic skills, so that's really kind of reflected up above in the exit exam requirements piece, but we also know certainly that academic skills are important, and the employment skills are reflected in that first bullet. But these are some of the other areas that I know as educators you spend time providing instruction on, and this really simply validates the importance of that we know that, that these are associated with better outcomes for students.
Okay, and in Oconee County, year before last, we started a course in Canvas. We use Canvas as our learning management system, but we created a course called Self-Determination and Student-Led IEP that will allow a teacher to earn 30 recertification hours for participating. And within the course, there are some assignments. There's a pre-test and post-test. But the culminating activity is to have a student actually lead their own IEP meeting, and that is recorded and is submitted through the course. And so we're very proud of that course, and we're always looking to make it better wherever we can.
So I think that moves us to the next slide, where I shared this long, somewhat 10,000 foot view of predictors on the previous slide, and I appreciate Marge fleshing out some actual examples. We have a resource at our website, which I'll share at the end, transitionta.org. It's called the Predictor Implementation Self-Assessment, and it really just simply helps break down each of those predictors so that we are speaking the same language when we're talking about what is self-determination or what do you mean by career awareness. So as an educator sitting down with a VR counselor or an educator simply sitting down with another educator down the hall, that we're talking about the same thing. So this is the operational definition from the research of self-determination, and so what we mean by that. And then I'll kind of move us, if we can, to the next slide. So for each of the definitions, we then have identified essential characteristics. So if I'm looking at the degree to which we promote self-determination in our school or in our district, what would that look like? And this provides, again, just some more fleshed out examples of what that might look like so that I can determine, are we doing this well, or could we be doing more? And it provides some examples for each of the predictors if they're broken down to this degree.
Very good. And I know in Oconee County, what we're trying to do is to foster more instruction of self-determination and more students leading their own IEP meetings. And, that is actually one of our goals that is on our path plan for improving our transition services to kiddos. So, we wanted to get a baseline for just how many teachers were actually teaching self-determination and how many students had actually led their own IEP meetings. So we did that a couple of years ago, and so now our goal is to increase that, because what gets measured gets done. So we are, we want to have this language in front of our teachers often. And so we've arranged for our Summer Institute, which our district does an in-house professional development, but we've asked some friends from SC Able to come and do a presentation for us called Self-Determination and Student-Led IEP Meetings, just to help make sure that our teachers have access to the resources and tools they need to be able to do that.
That's great. And that, I love that Canvas course piece that you shared about as well. So on the next slide is just, again, another example of defining what does paid work mean? What are we talking about? I think many of us can probably figure that out, but it does give some other examples that might lead into paid work. So authentic work is really what we mean when we're talking about paid. Of course, we would like for students to be paid, but we also want students to have real work experiences. And we recognize that sometimes that may, depending on the age of the student, may mean that it's more of a volunteering or a job shadowing type of experience that's going to lead into work experiences. I specifically highlighted these two predictors, self-determination and paid work, because we do from the research know that these two have the most research behind them and are most strongly related to not only better outcomes in employment, but also better outcomes in engagement with education after school and with satisfaction with life after school. So work experiences and self-determination, if you're going to do anything, those are certainly key to students being successful after school.
Very good. And, it would be wonderful if I could say that all of the work opportunities in our district were paid, but they're not. There are some school-based enterprises, though, that do offer opportunities for our students to learn skills while working, even though they're not paid. But we do have some paid, and we're always looking to grow that, wherever we can. So we are, doing our best to reach out to local businesses to expand our opportunities for that.
And again, reflecting back on the same example with the self-determination, these would be specific items that would be associated with paid work. So again, if I was looking at this as a district or a school to think about where could we make improvements, what could we beef up, what are we not doing yet, or what are we doing really well, looking at the essential characteristics can help examine those a little bit more closely. And I think, Marge, you had some specific examples here as well.
Yes, something that I did not mention earlier is that, we do work very closely with VR, vocational rehabilitation. They are able to find opportunities for our kids to get that paid work experience. And so, as we work together with VR, we invite them to our students' IEP meetings. We make sure that parents understand the role of VR and all of the wonderful resources that they can offer kids and young adults. And so I just, would encourage districts to, if you're not tapping into vocational rehabilitation, to get that relationship going, because they are instrumental in providing those paid work experience, or providing opportunities for those paid work experiences.
And so I think that takes us just to a reminder of where the stuff comes from that Marge and I didn't just make this up. There are what we talk about when you look at the resources on INTAC's website. We talk about predictors, which is what we've just been discussing, and these are identified from the correlational research. So we can't say that paid work leads to, paid work is definitely going to lead to enrollment in post-secondary education, but it is certainly predictive, it is correlated, it is related to those better outcomes. We also have identified through experimental research a large number of practices. So practices are really those typically intervention strategies, teaching strategies that have been found to be effective to teach specific skills to students with disabilities. And we have a large number of resources related to those that reflect the practices, and then specific strategies or specific, lesson plans for how to implement that practice. So that's a resource I'll talk about in a little bit, but I just wanted to put up on the screen the distinction between predictors and practices. The predictors come from correlational research and the practices come from intervention research. And that's probably enough researchiness. If any of you are super interested in that, you're more than welcome to be in touch with us, but that's probably enough for most. And on the next slide is just depicting, as we talk about using data to make these decisions about the programs in which students are involved and about the skills that we teach using those effective practices. We just want to keep this in mind, and I apologize for that little lost T on assessment. But we want to move from assessment data, and you all know this, but sometimes it's helpful to have that visual in front of us. How do we use that really good assessment, that rich information that we've gathered through the transition assessment process from students and families and others, and then capture that in the students' present levels of performance? From that, of course, writing measurable post-secondary goals. And that's where we can look at, so what are those effective practices and effective predictors that we know about that we want to be sure get into a student's plan, whether they're reflected in their transition services, in specific instruction in their annual goals, but making sure that we're looking back at what is effective, where to the degree that we can, and putting that in a student's plan and in their program. And with that, I believe Marge has a very specific resource for South Carolina aimed at the same goal.
Yeah, so it's a nice segue from number 7, where it says evaluation tool. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to share with you an extremely valuable tool when it comes to gathering and considering data for the credential pathway. When you go to the thesccredential.org website, you see the link at the top for compliance and monitoring. And after you click that link, you'll scroll down and you're going to see the link to the IEP or guidance for IEP teams document, where you can download it as a PDF or a Word document. So on this next slide, you can see a screenshot of what that looks like. The information here will be most helpful in assisting IEP teams when making decisions regarding the appropriateness of the credential course of study. And these requirements are according to law, and they are outlined. And so on the next slide, you're going to see that in many cases, there are 3 courses of study to consider. In Oconee County, anyways, we only have 3 options. We have the South Carolina High School Diploma, the South Carolina High School Credential, and then our local certificate of attendance. In your district, you may have more options, but regardless of how many options your district has, the important thing to remember is that the South Carolina High School Diploma should always be first consideration. Also, teams need to identify existing data or evidence that would support working towards a particular course of study. In other words, what evidence supports that a particular course of study is appropriate. So that evidence should come from multiple sources of data, which can include but may not be limited to information that's found in current and past IEPs, a student's attendance, perhaps results from a cognitive ability assessment or district assessments, or even classroom observations. Some other factors to consider can be part of a transition assessment, and these could be the student's post-secondary goal. What is their interest? The student's rate of work completion, or even the student's level of perseverance or attention to task, behavioral data, students' attendance and punctuality. On the next slide, you can see that within that IEP guidance document, there's something called Appendix A, and that is a data review collection form, and it offers a variety of sources of information that can be considered when making educational decisions. It can be used as is, it can be amended, or a district may choose not to use it at all based on their own needs. In Oconee County, we use all of the sources that are in this tool, and we even added a few more to our data collection tool that we use in-house. For example, our teams also consider longitudinal data. So now this screenshot here is a picture of Appendix A, so that you can kind of get an idea of what that looks like. And on the next slide are instructions for the Oconee County data review collection tool. And then on the slide after this, there is an example of the longitudinal data that we wanted to include in our data collection process. So in addition to the longitudinal data for grades, in our collection tool, we also added a section for adaptive behavior information, transition or work readiness assessment results, and agency involvement. We felt like, students whose parents were very supportive of outside agency involvement, that it's important to know that for kiddos when making those decisions. Continued course of study towards the credential must be made annually. So either Appendix A or a similar tool should be considered during annual reviews, as well as for the initial determination. Well, this is a lot of information that can take a lot of time to gather. And our special education teachers also need to have time to teach. So something that we're working on in our district is a Word document that uses MailMerge to pull data for selected students from PowerSchool and Enrich to make this available to IEP teams. So our Director of Data and Assessment is collecting all available information and matching it to student IDs using a program called SAS. So for example, students' grades, COGAT scores, MAP scores, PASS, SC Ready scores, and even the number of in-school and out-of-school suspensions can be included in this document that will be exported as an Excel file and shared with special education teachers, who can then use columns to fill in data that is not available at the district level. For example, they may want to consider an IQ score from a psychological report, or the specific results from a transition or work readiness assessment. Bottom line, in order to make sound program decisions, you need data, and you need a lot of it. And finally, on the last slide, we come full circle, and we get back to the importance of self-determination and students playing an active role in determining their own futures. So if a student is not able to earn a South Carolina high school diploma, or a team determines that that would not be the appropriate pathway, can he or she earn a South Carolina high school credential? Does the student believe that they can earn this credential? Why do they want it? Can they articulate their passion for wanting to pursue this pathway? Or do they need help with that? Could they benefit from some self-determination curriculum or coursework? So, Catherine, do you have anything to add to that particular slide?
I think I can move on into our resources, and just want to highlight a place within those that would reflect that the piece about student input. As I mentioned earlier, certainly we see self-determination as such a critical skill for students to develop, and we know that that can be developed in several ways, through explicit instruction on specific components of self-determination, as well as the process of participating in their IEP and in their educational program planning. So that whole piece of student input, at the transition assessment level all the way through the planning level, is important. And when you kind of scan down that list of resources that we have, almost to the bottom, the effective practices in secondary transition, if you're at our website, which again, I neglected to place on the slide, but it's transitionta.org. When you click on the tab for effective practices, that's where you will find the many different practice descriptions, as well as lesson plan starters. And there are several lesson plans related to teaching students how to be involved in their IEP process, as well as teaching some of those specific component skills, such as goal setting and decision making. So I can't emphasize that enough, and just wanted to point out that there are some resources, and I know TASC has some resources available as well for that. Moving back up to the top of the list, just to share what some of these resources are. The assessment to practice model reflects that visual that I shared on a slide, but it is also, it's a much larger document. So it really walks through what that should look like when we use transition assessment, and it drives the rest of the IEP. So it walks through those different components, those steps 1 through 7. And what we've done with that is embedded case study examples from different students. So a student in high school, maybe with a learning disability, or a student with more complex disabilities. So there's a few case studies within that resource, which takes me to the next bullet. We also have, and I know TASC and the Department of Ed in South Carolina have used some of these examples. We have case studies that may be helpful as you are thinking about what the IEP should look like, that just walk through, again, the process of what should be captured when you're looking at the quality and the compliance of your transition age IEP. So those are just some other resources that are available. I mentioned the predictor implementation self-assessment when I was speaking about the predictors. So this is a link to that document, and then there's a guide on using that document. So we use the predictor implementation self-assessment to identify where we maybe have some strengths and some needs related to specific predictors, and then the guide helps us think about how to put that into practice. For those of you in districts who've participated in the activities in South Carolina and you have a path plan, you've sort of walked through this process, through that process at the summits that have occurred in South Carolina, but this is just a resource that's available. We do have a few toolkits that may be of interest to you that some are newer than others. The Student Progress Monitoring Toolkit is exactly what it sounds like. So it's just a resource for, we talk about using data, but we don't always have good background knowledge of how to use data. So the toolkit provides some examples for teachers on how to collect different types of data and the different purposes for collecting those different types of data, and then some actual checklists and resources on how to capture that. It's also not just for teachers. There's resources in there for community rehab services providers and those who might be working with students out in the community. Then the evaluation toolkit is also what it sounds like, but it has a lot of resources. It's a pretty dense toolkit, I will warn you in advance, for not only student level data collection, but maybe district level data collection. And then the transition fair toolkit is also what it sounds like. So I know Marge mentioned hosting a transition fair for families. This is really the nuts and bolts of how you might set that up if it's not something you've done before, or how you might collect input on how it's gone, how you might get students involved in the planning and having students a little bit more engaged in a transition fair, so that they know what to do when they're participating in that. And then I've also mentioned the effective practices. One resource I neglected to mention, but I thought about it when we were discussing the predictors and use of that information at the student level. So if you want to write this down, you can Google it on our site or Google it in general. We have something called the Transition Gradebook, and that is an online data system, but really intended, again, to be used at the student level. So it's a school level resource to track the degree to which students are receiving or are participating in some of those predictors in their planning. So again, it's called the Transition Gradebook, and it's on our website. And if you have questions about that, that may be another resource as you're thinking about using data and collecting data to inform your decisions with students. It might be something else to consider. And then of course at the bottom is the link that Marge just spoke to.
This will conclude today's webinar, but please know that no question goes unanswered. We invite you to refer to the IEP team guidance document, the crosswalking document, and the frequently asked questions document. Additionally, you may ask a unique question using the South Carolina High School Credential Inquiry Form. And finally, if you are a special education director, you can request technical assistance. These options are all available by accessing the website, www.thesccredential.org. By visiting the website, you can also register for upcoming South Carolina High School Credential webinars. Here's the contact information for today's presenters. Thank you and have a great day.